The story takes us back to February of 1999, where a group of 3 decided to take a trip to Yosemite National Park. They were 42-year-old Carol Sund, her daughter, 16-year-old Julie, and Julie's friend, Silvina Liu, who was a 16-year-old exchange student from Argentina. Carol and Julie wanted to make the most of the brief amount of time Silvina had to stay in the U.S., so the two discussed potential things to do and places to visit, not entirely sure which they should pick. In the end, they agreed that visiting Yosemite National Park would be an amazing experience for everyone. Before they stopped by Yosemite, they first visited a number of other locations throughout California so Silvina could take in the sights. When they completed their list of other places to visit, the trio stopped by a motel located right outside the national park. The motel is known as Cedar Lodge. When the group was settled, they spent that day and the next exploring the park, taking pictures, and just enjoying each other's company. When it was getting late and dark on February 15th, the group decided to head back to their motel room and get some rest before heading back to the airport the next morning to return home. To add to the colorful collection of photos they had taken, Julie wanted to get a picture of her mom and Silvina. What you see on screen is that picture Julie took. Shortly after taking it, tragedy would strike. About 2 years before Carol, Julie, and Silvina made this trip to Yosemite National Park, a man named Cary Stayner applied for a position at the Cedar Lodge Motel, and he got hired as a handyman. Now, what exactly is Cary's relevance to the story, you may ask? Well, he kills Carol, Julie, and Silvina. Shortly after Julie had taken that picture I showed you earlier, or rather, he killed Carol and Silvina, then ran off with Julie, as he had much darker plans for her. Cary had walked up to the room the 3 were staying in and knocked on the door, stating that there were several issues with the bathroom. Obviously, it's not really people's first thought that they are at the threat of a killer, so Carol allowed Cary in. He said thanks and that he would be out in just a moment. He walked over to the bathroom with his tools and emerged shortly after. However, he had a firearm pointed at the group. Cary threatened them all, ordering them to stay silent. He told them that he was simply after their money and valuables, and that as soon as he got them, he'd be on his way and their lives would be spared. Everyone complied, and Cary motioned for them to move over as he grabbed his duct tape to tie them all up. Once everyone was immobilized, he then took the lives of Carol and Silvina, but left Julie alive. He had no intentions of keeping anyone alive for very long, and he couldn't care less about that money. Instead, he had a carnal desire that he wanted to satiate. One after the other, Cary tossed Carol and Silvina into the trunk of the rental car Carol had been driving. Then he tossed Julie into the front of the car where he could keep an eye on her, not like she was in any position to struggle anyway. Fast forward to the next day, February 16th. Carol and the girls were supposed to check out of the motel and start their drive to the airport, but they never checked out. Back home, Carol's husband, Jens, was waiting to pick up the group from the airport. They never showed up. He tried calling Carol several times, but every single attempt failed. Jens then suspected something bad had happened, but at first, he thought that maybe they had simply gotten lost. So he called authorities and informed them that his wife, daughter, and one of her daughter's friends had likely gotten lost in the woods of Yosemite National Park. This information was relayed down to a station closer to the park, and a search party was sent out to investigate and hopefully find the group. Investigators interviewed people at the motel and other hikers, asking if anyone had seen Carol or the girls. While a number of people did see them, no one really had any valuable information in terms of where they could be. So the search parties continued to comb the wilderness, and they eventually made a discovery. Someone had found Carol's wallet. However, it was found in a completely different location. The wallet was found in Modesto, which was west of the park by about 90 to 100 miles, depending on which route you took. At this point, some suspected that maybe the group wasn't simply lost in the forest. Maybe they had been abducted, or worse, killed, and the person had passed through Modesto. The search continued, and hope of even finding the three was starting to fade. But then, on March 18th, another discovery was made. Carol's rental car was found. But there was an issue, a major issue. The car had been completely burned. The car was found in Stanislaus National Forest, which was north of the motel where Carol, Julie, and Silvina were staying. This obviously confused investigators even more. Carol's wallet was found toward the west, while her car was found north and in the middle of the forest. It was becoming more and more clear that this was the act of someone with cruel intentions. A group of searchers set out from the location of the vehicle in search of Carol, but right as they were leaving, another person discovered the charred remains of not only Carol, but Silvina as well. Both of them had been found inside the trunk of the car. At this point, it was obvious that foul play was involved, but the search was not yet over. Julie was still missing, and authorities held out hope that she was still out there and alive. The story about these remains found in that charred vehicle quickly spread, which led to an interesting letter police had received. A handwritten note with a crudely drawn map and the phrase, "We had fun with this one," scrawled at the top. And you can probably take an accurate wild guess at who wrote and sent it. Authorities visited the location that was shared on the note, and when they got there, they indeed found the remains of Julie Sund. With the use of a search dog, medical officials shared that she had been assaulted and died as a result of a neck wound caused by a knife. They had also shared that while Carol had been strangled to death, Silvina had been shot. And just like Julie, Silvina had also been assaulted prior to her death. Authorities retraced their steps and went back to the Cedar Lodge Motel to thoroughly interview all of the staff, asking if they had seen anything or anyone suspicious. Among those who were interviewed was Cary Stayner himself. Police shared that at no point did anyone suspect him of being the culprit. He came across as a totally normal man. They revisited Modesto since Carol's wallet was found there. However, this was simply a red herring placed by Cary. I'm not sure about now, but at the time, Modesto was known for its criminal population. Almost everywhere you went in Modesto, there were offenders and illegal substance dealers. Cary knew this and thought that if he placed the wallet there, police would be more likely to assume that the killer was also in that location. As leads dried up, investigators thought to themselves, is it possible that the culprit was actually already behind bars for a different crime? They were actually convinced of this and gave up on the search, believing the killer was already apprehended. But fast forward to July, they would be in for a rude awakening. The headless remains of a young woman named Joey Armstrong were found in Yosemite National Park. This discovery pulled investigators back into reality. Carol, Julie, and Silvina's killer was still out there. Just a day earlier, on July 21st, Joey's friends had reported her missing after she failed to meet them for a hiking trip. Joey's body was found less than a mile from her cabin in the park. Investigators had stumbled upon it near a small stream after they were informed of Joey's disappearance by her friends. What had happened here was that Cary was wandering the woods and accidentally encountered Joey's cabin. Realizing that she was living all alone, he saw a perfect opportunity to strike. You see, Cary actually frequently went out and wandered the wilderness, indulging in a variety of substances. He ambushed Joey and threatened her with a firearm before tying her up. Based on the area around where Joey was found, investigators believed that there was an intense struggle. So they proposed the possibility that Joey had actually escaped from Cary after she was tied up in his truck. But she didn't get far before Cary caught up and took her life. According to some anonymous hikers, Cary's truck had been seen in the area of Joey's cabin. So police went over to the Cedar Lodge in order to talk to Cary. However, he wasn't there, strange, as he was said, to never be late or miss a day at work. Just days later, police received a tip on Cary's whereabouts. 2 police officers headed over to a nudist resort called Laguna del Sol, which was located northwest of the park. and it was there that police easily found and apprehended Cary. When officials went up to the front desk and showed a picture of Cary, they easily pointed him out in a tent, saying, "He's the only guy here with clothes on." In his possession, authorities found what they called a murder kit, basically just a combination of supplies that a killer would need. And now I'd like to take a look into Cary's past, as it is very interesting. And trust me, you'll want to stick around and listen to the entire thing. Cary Stayner had a brother named Stephen. Stephen had actually been kidnapped by a man named Kenneth Parnell in December of 1972 in Merced, California. Kenneth Parnell had recruited a man named Irvin Murphy to help him find and capture new targets. One target he had been eyeing was Stephen, so after studying Stephen's daily routine, he set a plan in motion. After Stephen left school, Irvin waited for him and handed him a religious flyer, claiming to be a representative of the local church. Stephen said that he was just a kid and didn't really have anything to donate to the church, but obviously Irvin didn't care about that and asked if his family could donate instead. Stephen said, "Yeah, my mom probably could." Irvin said that was great and asked the boy where he lived. After sharing his address, Irvin invited him into a white Buick driven by Kenneth, and the two headed over to Stephen's house. Not really. Instead, Stephen was taken to a secret cabin of Kenneth's. The whole drive, Stephen was confused and frequently told Irvin that they were not going in the right direction. At some point, Kenneth told Stephen that his parents could no longer afford him, so they gave Kenneth custody of Stephen. Days after being abducted, Kenneth started to rape the boy. He gave him a new name as well, Dennis Parnell. Kenneth, who now pretended to be his father, actually went out of his way to enroll him in schools over the following years. Kenneth also allowed his friends and acquaintances to take advantage of Stephen. As Stephen got older and his body began to mature, Kenneth was no longer attracted to him, and thus he began scouting for a new victim. Similar to how Irvin had helped years ago, Kenneth now had Stephen fulfill the role of luring people to him. On February 14, 1980, Kenneth and Stephen had set in motion a plan to kidnap a 5-year-old boy in Utah. However, Stephen actually returned the child to his parents instead of following through with Kenneth's plan. On March 1st, when Kenneth had a night shift, Stephen took the 5-year-old and left. The two went to a police station, and the very next day, authorities arrested Kenneth. Stephen and the other boy were finally returned to their loving families. For Stephen, it had been about 7 years of being locked away and abused. I've spent a lot of time on Cary's brother by now, so I don't want to drag this out too much longer. But long story short, Kenneth only received a 7-year prison sentence before later being convicted for other crimes in the mid-2000s, landing him a 25 to life sentence. He ended up dying in 2008. So now, with all of that out of the way, what is the significance of Stephen in Cary's life? Well, Cary was scarred by Stephen's kidnapping. Prior to Stephen's disappearance, Cary was a normal person with a good temperament. But after Stephen was kidnapped, you'll see that in a lot of photos of Cary during that period, he is actually wearing a hat. This was because he had uncontrollable urges to rip out his hair in frustration and despair over his brother. And in order to cope with these feelings, he did some strange things. He was also said to lash out violently at times for reasons that were seemingly meaningless. Fast forward to when Stephen returned to his family, everyone, including Cary, was ecstatic. However, Cary quickly grew to resent Stephen. Understandably, after getting one of their kids back, the Stayner parents gave Stephen a lot more attention. Cary felt as though he was being completely ignored. Additionally, Stephen was viewed as a hero by the public for saving that 5-year-old. There were even documentary-type movies and books made about Stephen for his courageous act. Cary grew envious and wanted his own movie. In later interviews, Cary said that one of the major reasons he even committed these acts of violence in the first place was in hopes that someone would create a movie about him, similar to Stephen. In September of 1989, Stephen Stayner actually died as a result of a motorcycle accident, specifically a hit-and-run event. The person responsible was later found, but they only received a 3-month prison sentence. Among those who appeared at Stephen's funeral was the little boy he had saved, now 18 years old. So anyway, to some, Stephen's kidnapping is viewed as the event that started Cary's downward spiral. After being arrested, Cary told police that he had wanted to hurt people for a very long time, and Carol, Julie, Sylvina, and Joey were simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't care who his target was, but he did prefer if they were female. In Cary's possession, investigators found recordings that he took before and after the victims' deaths. In all of those recordings, he was completely emotionless. I tried playing around with it so that I could play the recording for you all here, but no matter how I messed around with it, it kept getting picked up for age restriction. So if you are curious, feel free to search it up yourself. It's very easy to find. Ultimately, Cary pleaded not guilty. His attorneys tried to get him a lighter sentence by arguing that he was insane. They pointed back to the period when Stephen had been kidnapped, saying that it caused permanent psychological damage to Cary and that violence was simply a way for him to vent and release his pain. There was even a moment when Cary said he would confess to all 4 murders if he was given explicit material involving minors, which is just a crazy thing to say. I don't know if he was actually expecting to get something out of that, but regardless, he was sentenced to death in 2002, and he is currently on death row. This next entry takes us over to Indonesia. In March of 2017, there was a young man named Akbar Saliburo, a 25-year-old who lived in a village on the island of Sulawesi. Akbar spent his days gathering palm fruit from large trees using a long pole with a hook at the end. On March 25th, Akbar worked longer than usual. Several of his family members were out, so he had nothing to do back home if he left the fruit trees early. Instead, he stayed later and worked into the night. If you're not aware, Indonesia has some crazy wildlife, including massive pythons that can grow upwards of 20 feet. Usually, Akbar worked alongside other people, but this time he worked much later than usual, meaning everyone else had already left the area. This, combined with the thick cover of the forest, allowed for a massive python to sneak up on him. With precision, power, and speed, it latched its mouth onto Akbar and coiled its body around him. He was completely trapped. At this point, especially since Akbar was alone, there was little hope. The python's mouth expanded, and Akbar was completely consumed. His family returned home later that night and were confused to see that he wasn't there. Believing he was simply working late, they went to sleep. The next day, Akbar was still nowhere to be seen. When his co-workers arrived at the forest to harvest palm fruit, they also started asking if anyone had seen him, but nobody had. Authorities were contacted and a search for Akbar began. After learning from his family that he never returned home on the night of the 25th, the search focused on the forest where he had been working. After several hours of searching, there were finally signs of him. A group of men found one of his boots as well as the pole he had used to knock down palm fruit. However, nearby, they saw something terrifying. There was a huge trail left behind, one that locals immediately recognized. They feared Akbar had been attacked by a massive python. The search groups followed the python's trail, and it didn't take long for them to find a huge 300-pound python with an unusual, bloated shape. The men cut open the snake, and inside they found Akbar. I'm not going to show you the image of his body being removed, for obvious reasons, but if you really want to see it, it's easily found on Google. The first image of the discovery is already pretty disturbing, and unfortunately, by the time they found him, Akbar was long gone. This final entry takes us over to Wales in the year 2010 with a 15-year-old girl named Rebecca Aylward. She had a boyfriend named Joshua Davies, whom she had met a couple of years earlier, around the age of 13. The two got to know each other well, and started a deeper relationship at age 14. To all of Rebecca's friends and family, Joshua seemed like a completely normal kid. However, he had a hobby of collecting guns and knives, which worried Rebecca's sister. This concern grew when Rebecca told her sister that Joshua playfully threatened her while holding one of his knives. Rebecca laughed it off as a joke, but her sister believed Joshua had darker urges that he was suppressing. After being together for several months, Rebecca asked her parents if Joshua could stay over at their house for a few days. Her parents were skeptical, but in the end, they allowed him to stay. Everyone said that they had a great time together. Joshua seemed like a good kid. He was polite, outgoing, and had a good sense of humor. Joshua stayed at the Aylward residence for a weekend, and after saying his goodbyes to the family and returning home, he sent a text message to Rebecca. In it, he told her that he wanted to break up. This message came as a complete shock. Their relationship had seemed to be going smoothly, and Joshua was well liked by Rebecca's family, who also liked him in return. So, what caused this abrupt decision? Rebecca pushed back and asked why, but Joshua wouldn't reveal much. With no real answers, all Rebecca could do was accept it. However, Joshua didn't leave her alone after the breakup. Strangely, he actually began harassing Rebecca. There were even rumors spreading around school that Rebecca was pregnant, rumors that were started by Joshua himself. Later reports from Joshua's friends revealed that he had even talked about taking Rebecca's life. It was a wild thing to say, and since they were all teenagers, his friends assumed he was just being edgy. One of his friends even played along, thinking it was a joke, and offered Joshua free breakfast if he went through with it. Luckily, some of Rebecca's and Joshua's mutual friends told him to stop. Nobody understood why he was suddenly acting like a bully. Joshua also started spending time with another girl, and when Rebecca saw them together, she simply assumed this was his new girlfriend. This was sort of enough for Rebecca to finally move on, but deep down, she still had feelings for him, because she never really got any closure on why their relationship had ended so suddenly. The school year eventually came to an end, and Joshua seemed to have moved on. He rarely interacted with Rebecca anymore, and even the bullying had stopped. Fast forward to the next school year. Joshua suddenly became interested in Rebecca once more. The other girl he had been seeing was now out of his life, and on the surface, it seemed like he wanted to rekindle their relationship. And as I mentioned earlier, Rebecca still had feelings for Joshua, so she was willing to listen to almost anything he said. One day in late October 2010, Joshua asked Rebecca if she wanted to go for a walk in the woods with him. Without any hesitation, Rebecca said yes. The two agreed to meet up on the 23rd. That morning, Joshua was hanging out with some friends. After checking the time, he got up from the table they were all sitting at and left. He was headed for the woods. Meanwhile, Rebecca was at home, putting on makeup and choosing an outfit, thinking this was a date. Once she was ready, she said her goodbyes to her family and headed out. Rebecca had told her mother about the meeting with Joshua. Her mom was well aware of the terrible things Joshua had said and done to her. So, understandably, she was worried. When Rebecca arrived at the woods, she received a phone call from her mother. She just wanted to check in and make sure that Joshua didn't have anything bad planned. Rebecca reassured her, saying that Joshua hadn't arrived yet. So her mom stayed on the phone with her while she waited. A few minutes later, Joshua showed up. Rebecca hung up the phone, and the two began walking deeper into the woods. Around this time, Joshua also sent a text to one of his friends. I've seen about 4 or 5 different variations of what exactly the message said, but it was something along the lines of, "I'll be expecting that breakfast soon." As the two walked deeper and deeper into the wilderness, Joshua eventually started trailing behind Rebecca. He looked around to his left, to his right, and behind him, making sure that no one else was around. Then he bent down, picked up a rock, and struck Rebecca with it. The two wrestled on the ground, struggling against each other. For a brief moment, Rebecca managed to break free from Joshua's grip and ran off, desperate to escape. But Joshua quickly recovered, and before Rebecca could get away completely, he landed the finishing blow. Rebecca never returned home that day. Her mother immediately suspected that Joshua had done something terrible. She reported Rebecca missing and managed to get in touch with Joshua. When she asked if he knew anything about Rebecca's whereabouts, Joshua lied. He claimed he hadn't seen her that day at all. Faking a concerned voice, he insisted that he had been at his grandmother's house the entire day. Days passed, and still, there was no sign of Rebecca. During this time, Joshua continued sending texts to Rebecca's phone, trying to keep up the illusion that he had no idea what had happened to her. His messages made it seem like he was worried about her disappearance, but in reality, he knew exactly where she was. Then, one of Joshua's friends heard the news that Rebecca was missing. He immediately thought back to all the terrible things Joshua had done to her before. The thought crossed his mind. What are the chances that Joshua is actually responsible for this? Another student noticed something strange. Joshua had changed his profile picture on social media to a forested area nearby. Then others pointed out that this was the same location where Joshua and Rebecca had planned to meet. Several of Joshua's friends started connecting the dots. They shared their thoughts with the authorities, leading investigators to search the woods. And there, they found Rebecca's remains. This photo is one of the last known moments where Joshua and Rebecca were seen together, happy, before Joshua ended her life. And he didn't even have a real reason for doing it. He did it just because he could. At Swansea Crown Court, Joshua received a life sentence with a minimum of 14 years in prison. Initially, he denied everything. In fact, he even tried to shift the blame onto one of his friends. It wasn't until 8 years into his sentence that Joshua finally confessed. Do you think Joshua should have gotten a longer sentence? What should his so-called friends have done differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.